Bonjour. Et bonjour. And good evening, everyone. I want to thank the drummers and acknowledge the drum and thank you for that beautiful honor song. I also want to acknowledge our elder for your prayer, which began our evening in such a good way. Thank you very much. And Chief Plain, thank you so much for your opening remarks. We acknowledge that we're gathered in the Aamjiwnaang territory, and we thank you for the welcome to your home and to your homeland. Thank you very much. It is so great to be here tonight and to see such a full room. Full, of course, full of people, but full of good spirit. And I want to, in a way, offer an apology, because usually when I'm in a room like this, especially when there are many survivors in the room, and I know there are, and I want to acknowledge you, as well as the many intergenerational survivors who are here. I like to move around the room and say hello to people, and tonight I've been a little bit selfish, because I also want to acknowledge, along with the many elders that are here from your community, the many elders of my own life. I've got many aunts and uncles here who've come out tonight to honor me in that way by being here for me. And I also have longtime friends of my parents. I just spotted another cousin that I hadn't seen. Oh, who else here? Oh my goodness. So I have 4 of my 27 first cousins here, and that's just on my dad's side. And I say that, you know, because of course, it's always a happy time to be able to see family members you haven't seen for a long time. When you've been allowed to have family, when you've been allowed to make family relationships, when you've been allowed to grow up in the wealth, the extraordinary wealth of an extended family, as I was able to do, with all of these aunts and uncles and cousins and friends, who are all like one big family for me. And I come and bring you greetings from my husband and from the Dene people of the Northwest Territories, where my husband learned about extended family from me, because he did not get to have that. He, like so many of the survivors here, had that taken away from him. He had brothers and sisters whom he hardly knew and had to get to know as an adult. And he had a father whom he really never did get to know because he passed away so soon after school was over. So thank you for that. And know what an extraordinary thing it is. It was not the case, family, for so many people in this room. And so I say, that's how we say back home. We give thanks to the Creator for the gift of this day and the grace that has brought us all safely to it. We have unbelievable birds in Yellowknife, north of 60. We have ravens that are so huge they're the size of turkeys. But we don't have blue jays. So how about those blue jays? That was pretty great, right? Even my dad, who used to get so mad at blue jays stealing from the other bird food in his many birdhouse stands, would have been happy to see the different kind of blue jays that were in action last night and ongoing. So tonight is very good to be back in my other home with some family members and friends among you, and in this part of the country where I did spend my childhood, and I thank you, Reverend Matthew, for those very good words. I even had a greeting tonight from my very first teacher. My very first teacher, Sherry Hext, who's here somewhere tonight. I lost track of where she's sitting. There she is. She's taking credit for everything. One of the things she told me about myself, and it wasn't necessarily in a good kind of a way, was that I was a chatterbox. Myself and Susan Sykes, who's sitting right here, my very first friend. And so, because you're at risk of that, and my chatterbox side, I have written some things down to try to contain myself a little bit. So I hope you'll allow me to speak from the page as well as from the heart. I wanted to say to you that, you know, I've actually traveled a very long way in my life to find myself right back here at home before you tonight. And in a way, I've gone full circle, especially full circle on the story that we all are all gathered here around. The story that has brought new aunties in my life. I look at Geraldine Robertson here, and Susie, who was one of the very first survivors that I met. And it's so good to see you here again tonight, to know that we can add to our family along the way. But my story began so many years ago in Petrolia, and it was in my first memory that is relevant to this story, residential schools, was in Mrs. Hibbert's classroom, her sunny little classroom in Queen Elizabeth II School. It was in Petrolia. Susan was there with me, also in that classroom. And there we were, and there on the wall before us was that multicolored Rand McNally map, the map of Canada. And I can still see it. And the largest section of all was in our very favorite little girl color. It was pink. And it was the Dominion of Canada. Some of you may remember that map. What I could not see then was that the part where I have now spent the majority of my life, which is the Northwest Territories, was not even in the picture, not even named. And what I also couldn't recognize was all that was hidden behind those two main words, Dominion and Canada. I grew up with the same knowledge gaps as probably most of you in this room, and certainly most children of my generation. We grew up with educated ignorance, both about our vast geography, especially its northern parts, and certainly about any history of Canada pre-Dominion. We were taught as if the history of Canada began with the arrival of Europeans. The other rooms that marked my early childhood were in St. Paul's Church on the main street in Petrolia. And among other things, I remember the flat little wooden plates for the children's weekly collection. I remember putting 1 or 2 pennies a week that my parents could barely afford onto that plate, and being told that it was to help the little Indian children up north. I never once imagined that they were living anywhere other than in their own homes or with anyone other than their own parents. And it certainly would never have crossed my mind at that time that some of them were being raised and taught by the people hired by the very same church that I attended and that I understood only as a Sunday morning event. The same church that is so strongly represented in this room tonight. I also could not foresee that one day I would be married to one of those little boys up north, and that without knowing it, I would in fact be married into an entire extended family of multi-generational residential school survivors. I also could not have foreseen that after 30 years of journalism and a lot of international work, I would be selected as one of 3 commissioners of the Historic Truth and Reconciliation Commission right here in Canada. And it was set up to begin unveiling secrets in our own country. The commission was to find out what was happening for more than a century to my husband and to some of you here tonight, and to 150,000 other children in all those faraway places. All things happening out of sight, out of mind, while the rest of us were learning half-truths about Canada in our classroom. Our commission was meant to shed light on one of the country's earliest, longest-lasting, and most damaging policies, the policy of Indian residential schools. It's a policy that characterized the very nature of the Dominion of Canada, with its built-in European imperative to dominate the colony. And it is a policy that has defined and damaged the relations between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada for almost the entire 150 years of our existence as a country. Our job as a country has been threefold. One, to reveal the many hidden or unspoken truths about the residential schools. Two, to identify and assess their continuing impacts today. And three, to encourage and inspire an ongoing individual and collective process of reconciliation, a process intended to benefit all of us. So what do we mean by hidden truths? And I know some of you in this room already know a lot about the residential schools. Some of you know far more than you ever wanted to remember, but there are also in this room, as there always are, people who are coming to this story for the first time, and you need to be reminded and taught, shall I say, of some of the things the rest of us have already learned. So what do we mean by hidden truths? Well, how about this? While I was going to kindergarten, here's what was happening to another young girl who was around the same age as me. And she spoke to me a year and a half ago as now a fully grown woman and an elder. She said, I went to school at age 3. Some of the kids who were at the school before me called me stupid and dumb because I didn't understand English. This nun put a wristband on me. It said pagan. I had to wear that wristband for everyone to see. I thought it must be because of my parents. I was so embarrassed. They practiced traditional sweats and things like that, so I didn't want to be like them. I tried to eat more communion wafers just so I could get that evilness out of me, that paganness out of me. So in these words, you have just one sampling from the 7,000 statements from former students of Canada's Indian residential school system that we've recorded over the course of our work in the last 6 years. The children of survivors, the so-called intergenerational survivors, and Chief Plain made reference to them also, they've also played a hugely important leadership role in helping us understand the impact and especially the legacy today of the schools. Here's what a couple of them have told us. I can't imagine what they did to him to make him think he couldn't love his own child. I never understood why he left me alone all the time. I always thought it was my fault. I never felt good enough as a young girl. I used to buy food and alcohol so people would hang around me so I wouldn't be alone. All I ever wanted was a hug from my dad. I used to look all over to find that. This epidemic or genocide or whatever they call it, it affects all of us. Sometimes, she said, you don't realize you can live a better life because you don't know how. And this one, who grew up in the child welfare system, because the state, which through the residential schools had harmed her, then determined that she was an unfit parent. The daughter said, and I should just describe the scene. This was in a room where we learned later the mother was actually in the room. And the daughter had not grown up with the mother, but had come to know who she was. And this is what she said to the commissioner, to me. I was the commissioner that day. She said, as we get older, we think, we don't understand why your mother can't take care of you. We're filled with anger, hate. We end up hating her. And we're prejudiced. We're even filled with self-loathing because natives do nothing but drink, and you were raised in the white community in the child care system. And all of those people disparage natives. And then, a very important turning point in her story, and then she said, you find out that your mother was sent to residential school and lived through many things. You stop blaming her and you forgive her. And now I can love my mother and tell her, I can say, I don't blame her. I don't blame her. I can even tell her I love her. And then she said this, I don't blame you, Mom. I love you, Mom. Knowing that her mother was somewhere in that room. Well, in addition to this very compelling statement gathering, and I can assure you that these are fairly modest examples, I'll call them modest examples, that we've also done many, many other things as a commission. And I don't think the time here tonight allows me to go over all of that, and in any case, some of you will have been accompanying us along the way, and some of you will be very familiar with it. But I want to mention one thing, and then I want to start to share with you some of the things that we've learned. One of the things that we were obliged to do was create a history, and so we had to bring in archival material from the government that had massive written archives. We had to pull together archives from the churches that ran the schools, including the United Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church, the Anglican Church, and several entities of the Catholic Church. Mountains of archival material. What we did not have is any archives from the children, because they were children after all, and we're not creating archives. So we did oral statement gathering, so that we would have the oral history of the children's side of the story, as it were. And we did a lot of that in public because we knew that would be a way to help educate the Canadian public, to reach out through the media and through open, free events that everyone could feel welcome to come to. But there were many things that we did that were a bit more understated, let me say. But they were very intentional because we tried in every way to make clear that the work we were doing had to do with the healing of broken spirits and was therefore sacred work. So each of those 7 national events, instead of giving them a clever thematic title, we gave each of them a value title. And we worked with the 7, what are called the 7 sacred teachings, or the 7 grandfather teachings in some traditions. In our United Church, they are often the things that are embedded in the Beatitudes and other teachings of the biblical lessons that we learned as we grew up. So the first one that we held in Winnipeg, the theme was respect. The second one that we held in Inuvik, the theme was courage. The third big national event that we held was in Halifax, and the theme there was love. The fourth event was in Saskatoon with a theme of truth. The fifth one we held was in Montreal with a theme of humility. The event that was held in Vancouver had a theme of honesty. And the theme, the 7th of the national events, was in Edmonton with a theme of wisdom. And so when people say, what can we do? There are many things that we can do that are practical, but there are also behavioral things we can do, which is to try, all of us consciously, to live the values that we've been raised with and that we know. So as I say, time doesn't allow me to go into a lot of detail about the many other things that we have done, but I do want, we've talked to all kinds of professional groups, to academia, to corporations and businesses, to multiple levels of governments and government agencies. But I do want to share with you some of the lessons that we're learning from residential school history and from our work. A number of harsh truths for sure, but also some very hopeful signs for reconciliation. So here are a few of each. First, that we create deep and lasting problems for ourselves when we act as if one group of people knows better than another group of people what is best for them and their children. Also, we've learned that both the English and French languages have been used as weapons to destroy Indigenous languages and cultures. We've learned that the high rate of addictions and mental health issues among Aboriginal peoples and the epidemic of suicide in many regions, and I call it epidemic because I am convinced that if it was happening in non-Indigenous communities, we would have declared it an epidemic a long time ago. We have the worst suicide rate in the world among the Inuit of Canada. It is an epidemic, and these things are related to residential school experiences and the continuing untreated trauma of separating children from parents. It is an urgent and critical national crisis. We've also learned that there is great potential, and this is the turning point that we are at right now. There is great potential to repeat the betrayal and actually worsen relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples by doing nothing or little in response to the real harms and needs that survivors have come forward to describe, that we've talked about in our report and upon which we've recommended such action. We've also learned that Indigenous peoples want to believe that the rest of Canada is listening and, most importantly, cares enough about all of this to help do something about it. That most Canadians who do learn about the schools immediately share a sense of outrage at what happened, knowing that it was not right, and are upset at not having been told about it, at not having been taught it in our schools, at not having known it was happening, even though our governments did know. And that most people have a genuine desire to help set things on a better course. We've also learned that individual acts of kindness and caring and respect can and do make a positive difference, and I could give you so many examples of that were there more time. We've also learned that schools and all institutions of learning, that religious and faith communities, the RCMP, police and child welfare agencies, and all various levels of government, all of which were a big part of the problem in the past, have a huge role to play to address the situation now. And when I say part of the problem, I mean because the schools did not happen because Aboriginal people created the schools. The schools happened because the government of Canada passed laws that made the schools mandatory and threatened people with jail if they didn't release their children to go, and then claimed their children as wards of the state. So all levels of government and the RCMP, who were often involved in rounding up the children, have played a role in that. But that, as I say, there is great potential, and we are seeing great signs of commitment on the part of many of those same agencies and schools and departments of education and so on to help redress the situation now. We've also learned and are still learning that the human capacity for resiliency is enormous. That some of the survivors who came forward could share their stories after saying what had happened to them and could still show up and talk about it. It was nothing short of miraculous, as I understand that word. We have also learned that Indigenous pride and the return to spiritual practices is growing, and that's why the significance of the prayer in Aamjiwnaang is so important, and why the drum song and the drum itself being here, those are important things. And we've learned too that the Indigenous capacity for forgiveness and reconciliation is almost beyond belief, and as I heard one United Church minister say in Saskatchewan, it is almost so far beyond deserving. That was the term that she used. And we've also learned, and I've felt it myself, I have to say, I certainly felt it at our closing in June, and again at the General Council in August, and at many things I've been to since, that there is emerging hope that things can get better. And finally, we've learned, and I think we knew all along, but I think we're getting the word out there, that reconciliation will take time. It took us a long time to get into this state of disrepair, of disconnection, and it's going to take time for us to rebuild, or for, in many cases, build for the first time. So if we do want to see justice for the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, and if we do want to see dignity for the country as a whole, we must begin to understand that reconciliation is not up to survivors to discover alone. It's not up to Indigenous people to discover alone. The long and steady process of reconciliation belongs to all of us. Reconciliation requires ongoing vigilance as well, to make sure that we don't slide backwards, now that we know we can't allow ourselves to suddenly unknow. To ensure that we are living up to the laws of our country, We have been breaking our own laws when we break treaty promises. And also the laws expected of us by the wider world. And there I'm talking about things like the United Nations Genocide Convention, the Human Rights Convention, the rights of the child, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which we have said should be seen and understood as an ongoing framework for reconciliation. So those of you who are actively asking yourselves, what might reconciliation mean going forward, that would be a really valuable document to familiarize yourself with if you haven't had a chance to do that. What we have said, if the UN Declaration is a framework for reconciliation, the TRC's 94 calls to action are a suggested roadmap to reconciliation, a recipe almost. And I would really ask those of you, and thank you so much, organizers, for having those available and handy. You'll see that it's not 94 pages. It's 94 calls to action. It's not overwhelming, it's readable. It is discussable with your family and your children and your grandchildren. And so we can look at them, we can become familiar with them, and I think most importantly, each of us can go through those and say, where do my initials belong? Where do my initials belong as an individual who has influence, or as an individual who has means, or as an individual who has influential friends who can help make something happen? Where too do my initials belong as a collective? Whether that is my Aamjiwnaang community and First Nation, what is the work that needs to be done on this community, in this community and with the children here? Whether it is a faith community, whether that is the United Church or some other faith tradition, whether it is a school board, whether it is a professional association, a dental association, my cousin Drew sitting over there, whatever it is, whatever spheres of influence we live in and work in, and most of us are involved in many, see whether there's a place in those calls to action that you might do something or that you might encourage someone else who might be better placed to do something. So how do we make these recommendations real? That's the question I was asked today. I can't answer that for you. I have many examples here, and I think I may just leave that if there's time in a question and answer to offer you some suggestions if that does interest you. But what I want to say is the question does not belong to me, the question belongs to you. How do we make those recommendations real? And one of the first pieces of the answer is make what you're doing here tonight, and I don't mean necessarily having me or somebody else as a guest speaker, though that can be so, but putting yourselves in the same rooms together, people who have not historically sat together in the same rooms. Make that not an extraordinary thing. Make that an ordinary thing, so that we start to normalize relationships, so that we can stop being what I've always said are the real two solitudes in Canada, not the French and English, but the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. And how do we get beyond that? 3 weeks ago, I was at an event at McGill University in Montreal, and they were celebrating, very proud to celebrate, and rightly so, their 5th annual Aboriginal Awareness Week. And I was asked to be there, and I was honored to be there, but I said to them, let us not forget the irony of your gathering. How is it that we're about to celebrate the fact that we've been living together in this country for 150 years, and we have to be 5 years in on a special event to become aware of each other? How is that possible? We have structured ourselves legally and socially and economically to live in isolation from each other and to live in ignorance of each other and to deprive each other of the richness of what each other has to offer and the wisdom of what each other has to offer. And we can change that. So that is a good question. How do we make these recommendations real? Chief Plain has welcomed you here. I'm certain he would welcome you back another time. And others of you here have other gathering places where you might initiate the welcome. But to have conversation that helps you begin to know each other not as co-citizens, but as neighbors and as friends. We can no longer afford to be strangers to each other in the country that we now share. Uncontestably, we share it now. We must be honest about those real two solitudes, and we must commit to doing tangible things to close the divide in awareness, understanding, and relationship, so that justice may be seen to be done in the everyday realities of the Aboriginal peoples who live at the lowest end of the charts on every socioeconomic measure in our country. This is Canada's chance to breathe new life into the spirit of what some of our very oldest laws say, and by those I mean the treaty agreements. A chance to see the treaties signed between the founding nations of our country as they were originally presented, not as contract law, but as sacred covenants intended to bind us together in relationships of respectful coexistence. So in a true spirit of reconciliation, we could come to understand, as we have said in our report, that we are all treaty people. Sometimes I say, we get that when it has to do with marriage. We know that not just the one person gets married. Both people get married. But somehow when it comes to treaty, we have a feeling that it's an Indigenous treaty, but the rest of us who were signed up for it by our governments of the day have no part in it. And we have to rethink that and own up to our part. So own this whole story, this whole opportunity, as I see it, as Canadian history, not Aboriginal history. The children and families who lived this are not the ones who designed it, Canada did. Do what you can to help get residential school history taught to every student in this province, as is now starting to happen in other parts of the country. My granddaughter is 12. Next year she's going to go to high school. An Indigenous kid who's going to learn, along with every other Indigenous child in the North, about history of the Dene people, about treaties, and there's more than one up there, about residential schools, the highest per capita number of residential school survivors of anywhere in the country. And she and all of her friends, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, will not be able to graduate high school unless they have done that course of study. We need that to be the case everywhere, so that we don't miss anyone, so that we are all learning the same truths about our country. We have a batch of newly elected people, and I noticed on the map that this is a very blue part of the country. But we have a new Prime Minister who said some very important things last night, which on this topic, if we are all sincere in being in this room together, binds us all together, no matter what political stripe may be your preference. Because as we've said many times over, reconciliation is not a partisan issue. Reconciliation belongs to all of us and all jurisdictions. The education, child welfare, poverty, criminal justice system, employment policies and practices, resource sharing, decision making, commemorating, those are all areas where we can begin to do things differently. We need community leadership, we need spiritual leadership, we need political leadership. So make sure that you and your elected leadership of whatever stripe, at whatever level, have an informed opinion about all of these things. Ask them if they've read the 94 calls to action, and if they haven't, insist that they do. We have to take people where they're at, because there are a lot of people who don't yet know any of this, but we need to provide tools and help people so that we can contribute to filling in those gaps. And especially, I need to say, gear up for the long haul. Gear up for the long haul. It's not going to be fast, but it's going to be rich and enriching. Reconciliation will not come overnight, but we will all benefit from it. And you're not alone. This is not though it is a kind of a family gathering in many ways, as I've already described, I'm asking the same thing, and all of us as commissioners are, all over the country. Last night we heard extremely important words come from our Prime Minister-elect. He said he intended to move forward with an intention of a nation-to-nation relationship. He said that. We all heard it, and we need to hold him to account on it, and make sure that whoever your elected leaders are well aware that needs to be held to account as well.